Okay, folks, this week we're finally going to talk about doing archaeology. And so to do that, we got to go back and cover some basic concepts. So I'd highly recommend that before you watch this video, you go back and watch the week 1 lab materials just to kind of refresh some of those really core, critical, again, basic central concepts in archaeology, what a site is, what an assemblage is, etc., because this is going to build upon that quite directly. So we're going to look at some other concepts that are fundamental to the practice of archaeology: scale, context, which we've already talked about a little bit, and site formation. And part of site formation, I also incorporated a bit about preservation of artifacts as well. And I just wanted to give a content warning that there are images of human remains in this presentation, and I'm using them intentionally and specifically to illustrate the impact of the preservation environment on soft tissue, essentially how mummification occurs under different environmental conditions. So we're going to begin with this idea of scale, and it's part of spatial analyses. And so because archaeological sites and cultural remains are distributed across geographic space, we want to understand that, right? We want to know why sites are found where they are, why artifacts are found in association with each other. So there's a whole bunch of different kinds of levels at which we can do this analysis, and this is one of the ways that we talk about scale in archaeology. And so I've kind of walked you through in this PowerPoint, in the notes below, this example, right? And so it begins with, like, let's look at a big research question, and we'll be talking about research design next week. So if we start with a big question of scale, this one is looking at, or is asking this idea of the first or the earliest settlement of Europe by farmers, okay? And so we can look at this from a European or a very broad regional scale. But that might be too big of a picture. We might want to narrow it a bit more down to understand, well, why were they settling in the areas they did? And so in this case, what they found is that the earliest sites are associated with the Northwest German region. So they've kind of zoomed in, and you'll see that a lot of the sites, so the areas shaded in blue, the areas that are settled by first farmers, are associated with the Rhine River. So maybe we want to narrow down our focus a little bit more and look at a smaller region and look at the distribution of sites across the region. And one of the things that becomes clear about this when we look at a small regional perspective, or at a small region scale, is that you start to understand that, oh, well, the sites are not just associated with the Rhine River because it's a waterway, but because the Rhine River is associated with a particular type of soil called loess, and we'll talk about loess. It's a wind-deposited fine-grained sediment. It's excellent for farming in. And so now we're starting to get a clearer picture of why farmers were settling in this region. But this still might be too big of a picture. We might want to, again, narrow it down and look at relationships between a grouping of sites. And so in this case, now we're not looking at just the Rhine River, but we're looking at one of its smaller tributaries, the Mersbach River, and we can look at groupings of sites that are in association with this. And we can then look at a particular cluster of sites. And so in this case, what they're looking at is not even just a cluster of sites, but an individual small village site. Now we can start to get at different kinds of structures that were present. How do we know it's a small village? Well, we have different houses, we have a path or a feature, we have a silo or a storage facility, right? And we expect to see silos with farming, so you need to store your grains and your products. And then they also distinguish that there's different kind of phases of house structures as well. We have a refuse pit or a midden as a feature. And even this might be too large of a scale. Maybe we want to get at an individual experience or an individualized experience of a farmer in this village. And so we might look at an individual structure or a house. And so you can see then that at this scale, we can start to look at structures within the house, such as post holes. So these would have been holes that were dug down, and then posts, like basically the major beams of the house would have been then buried down into it. Of course, wood, we're going to talk about, doesn't preserve very well, so all we may have then is the remnants of those holes that have been filled in with other sediment. There's a little scatter of artifacts they indicate here on the outside of the structure, and this might tell us something, again, about this being a house, because maybe in the scatter of artifacts, maybe it's, again, a midden, but of household waste. And by now, you're very familiar with household waste. Okay. So a review of context, but also a more specific discussion about how we define it in archaeology. And so I've given you some examples here of what context looks like in an archaeological site, and know that it's made up of three key things. It's provenience. So this is its three-dimensional location on the surface of the earth. We have the matrix, which is the sediment or other material that's kind of surrounding the artifact. This is important to identify because it impacts the preservation environment. And then the association. And so what this picture on the left here is showing you is a bunch of information about this projectile point that I excavated back in 2007. So all of this information is part of the context of that particular point. It tells me exactly what archaeological site it was found at. FAOM 22 is the Bodo site in southern Alberta, what part of the site it was found in, what 1 meter by 1 meter unit. And we'll talk about this when we talk about mapping, about how we break down space into incrementally smaller units, another aspect of scale, right? In order to have control over this kind of contextual information. I know exactly how far below the surface this point was found. So it was found at excavation level 4, which is between 30 and 35 centimeters depth below datum. So that's below the surface. And then a description of what it was, what date it was found, and who recovered it. And so all of this information becomes part of the context of the find and allows us to make much greater, more nuanced interpretations about it. In terms of the matrix, you can see it's quite a dark, sandy sediment. A lot of it's dark because of the organic materials that are present. This projectile point here, its tip is broken off. And I might be able to interpret that better because of its association with things like this artifact here. Actually, that's an ecofact here. Oops. And this ecofact there, those are fragments of bison bone. So we have a projectile point that has a broken tip, a tip that break that is very common with an impact fracture. So you imagine someone shoots an arrow and it hits something hard in an animal like bone. The tip of it breaks off, or maybe it snaps off during processing. And then we have the bones of that animal that was being hunted using this projectile point. So see, if I just have a projectile point without that context, all I can say is that this is a projectile point. It's an arrowhead. And I know that because of the context of them in other sites. But when I consider its association with other artifacts and ecofacts within the archaeological site, now I can make more nuanced interpretations. So not only is this a projectile point, but it's a projectile point that was used for hunting bison. And then again, the matrix tells me something about the preservation. We have all these little rootlets popping up through. That is what we call an end transform, or a natural site formation or transformation process. And so the association between these artifacts might have been impacted because of all these little rootlets going through and moving and adjusting different artifacts and ecofacts around. And then I give you another example here of what contextual association looks like and why it's important. Then I give you some other examples of how we document and record provenience, so please read through those. In the PowerPoint, I also distinguish between what is primary context, or where we think in situ context, basically where materials were left behind deliberately, intentionally, versus secondary context, which are contexts that are not where the artifact or ecofact was being used, where it was left behind, but it's kind of like where it's been separated out. So middens are an example of a secondary context, right? We're finding all the waste and garbage, and that's not where those bones were being processed. It's not where the stone tools, or in this case, the metal tools, were being used, but it's where they're being disposed of once their use has been completed. And because context is so important, then we can talk about why then we think looting is so problematic. When pot hunters dig up sites to find and sell artifacts that they have assigned a value to, this impacts our ability to interpret those finds, and that's a negative thing. Along with understanding context, we need to understand site formation, and the major concepts that I want to get across in terms of site formation, you'll see here in the PowerPoint, relate to the study of site formation processes. Oh, sorry, here my window's not moving. There we go. Which comes to us thanks to the work of behavioral archaeologist Michael Schiffer, who talks about C transforms and N transforms. And so I go through the differences between C transforms, including constructive and destructive C transforms in this PowerPoint, and then I give some examples of N transforms as well. And so basically the understanding of this concept of C and N transforms is to understand that again, what we find in the archaeological record, right? When we encounter a site, when we're excavating a site, when we're analyzing artifacts, that they are where they are because of these processes, right? That we are not just getting a perfect photograph of the past, but rather the remnants of the past that have been transformed over time. So part of this is also understanding then preservation environment, that sea and transforms, as well as the matrix and the climate, all impact what evidence is recovered by archaeologists, what is preserved in the archaeological record. And so you don't have to memorize this table, but I put this in here to illustrate to you that some materials are just more frequently going to be found in archaeological sites than others. So stone preserves well in basically any environment, so it should be no surprise that the oldest known artifacts are stone, because they're the ones that are going to last millions of years, potentially, right? Textiles, on the other hand, organic materials, they don't preserve as well. They require very specific environmental conditions, right? They need to be either really cold, really dry, really wet, really hot. So all of these different factors influence what we find in archaeological sites. And so then I go through some examples of preservation, of some of the conservation steps that can be undertaken to protect these materials and preserve them once they've been removed. So here's my example of mummification, and I'll just illustrate here that each of these different famous well-known mummies from various collections around the world show us that mummification or preservation of organic materials favors extremes, be they very warm and wet environments, like this is Lindo Man, who was recovered from a bog. This is Ötzi, the Iceman, who was recovered from a glacier, again, a very extremely cold and wet environment. Many Egyptian, of course, mummies are associated with the very dry and very warm climate of the desert of Egypt. But Peruvian mummies, like this individual here, can also result from very cold and dry environments. Anywhere in the middle here, kind of moderately wet, moderately cold, moderately warm, moderately dry, and then environments like ours that have a lot of seasonal variation, really hot summers, really cold winters, we don't have very good organic preservation. And then I give some examples of some specific archaeological sites where natural disasters or end transforms have played a significant role in preservation of artifacts in them and the different kinds of artifacts that have been found. I have a little bit of discussion about Pompeii because I wanted to emphasize the Pompeii premise. And it's this notion again that even in sites like Pompeii, where we have so many things preserved, that it's still not a perfect or complete picture of the past, right? That organic materials did not preserve well. Instead, what we find are these voids. And luckily, an archaeologist was able to figure out that the hollows that were left in the ash after the organic materials had basically broken down, had decayed, had dissolved, that by pouring in plaster into the ash and the pumice, then you could remove the pumice and chip it, or an ash, chip it away, and what you get are these negative casts then of where basically voids were. And so we have examples of this where individuals had lain down and passed away. We have people curled up with each other, pets, all of these different things. But even then, it's not a complete picture, right? We're still having to interpret, well, why was this individual laying here? What was the context under which they found themselves here? So this leads us then to the golden rule of preservation, that just because we don't find evidence for something in a site doesn't mean that those sorts of activities or those sorts of materials were being used in the past. So for example, in my sites in Tanzania, we find lots of stone tools, and we find lots of stone tools that we know from experimental archaeology, from talking with living communities that use stone tools, that they would have had wooden or bone handles. But wood and bone doesn't preserve well in the region I work in, and so as such, we don't have evidence of those handles. But they must have existed. They must have been there, because we know, again, that projectile points can't be used without being affixed to some sort of handle or shaft, right? So just because we don't have evidence for wood in the past doesn't necessarily mean it wasn't being used, right? We have to be aware, again, of context. We have to be aware of preservation. We have to be aware of site formation processes in order to understand how that artifact came to be where it was when an archaeologist found it. Okay. So do the summary. Remember that this week is a lab activity, so I encourage you to look at those materials that have been posted. And then next week, we'll actually look at archaeological fieldwork itself. So we'll begin with research design. How do we come up with questions? And then how do we actually go about recovering those remains that have been preserved for us in the archaeological record?